What happens when one of America's most successful entrepreneurs sits down for what should be a friendly late-night chat, only to discover the host has prepared an ambush that would make a prosecutor jealous? The tension in Studio 6A was thick, enough to cut with a knife as Mark Cuban settled into the guest chair across from Stephen Colbert, completely unaware that he was walking into what would become one of the most explosive interviews in late-night television history. Cuban had appeared on the show before, always delivering the kind of engaging conversation that makes for great television. His blunt honesty and business acumen had made him a favorite guest, someone who could match wits with any host while keeping the audience entertained. Tonight was supposed to be different, though, because tonight Colbert had an agenda that went far beyond entertainment. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below, telling us what you think about this whole situation, because what unfolds next is absolutely insane. The billionaire entrepreneur looked relaxed as the cameras rolled, flashing that familiar confident smile that had become his trademark across countless television appearances. He was there to discuss his latest business ventures and maybe share some insights about the current state of the economy. Or at least that's what his publicist had arranged with the show's producers. What Cuban didn't know was that Colbert had spent the entire day preparing what could only be described as a calculated attack disguised as an interview. The host opened with his usual theatrical charm, that signature smirk playing across his face as he welcomed Cuban to the show. The audience applauded enthusiastically, clearly excited to see the Dallas Mavericks owner and Shark Tank star in person. Everything seemed perfectly normal, just another night of late-night television banter between two seasoned media personalities who had developed a comfortable rapport over the years. But something felt different in Colbert's tone from the very first question. There was an edge there, a sharpness that suggested this wasn't going to be the light-hearted conversation Cuban had prepared for. The host leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he posed what seemed like an innocent enough opening question about Cuban's recent comments regarding economic policy. Cuban answered thoughtfully, as he always did, drawing on his decades of business experience to provide genuine insights. That's when Colbert struck with his first real blow, interrupting Cuban mid-sentence to challenge not just his answer, but his entire worldview with a question so loaded with assumptions and accusations that it caught the billionaire completely off guard. The audience, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere, fell unusually quiet as Cuban paused, clearly trying to process what had just happened. The entrepreneur had faced hostile interviews before, dealt with aggressive reporters and combative panel discussions, but this felt different. This was someone he had considered a colleague, someone whose show he had supported by appearing multiple times, now treating him like a hostile witness in a courtroom drama. Cuban's expression changed subtly, the easy smile fading as he realized this wasn't going to be the conversation he had signed up for. Colbert pressed his advantage, following up with another pointed question that seemed designed more to embarrass than to elicit any meaningful response. His tone had shifted completely from the welcoming host to something much more aggressive, almost prosecutorial in its intensity. The studio lights seemed harsher somehow, the intimate talk show setting suddenly feeling more like an interrogation. Cuban, to his credit, didn't back down. Instead of deflecting or trying to change the subject, he met Colbert's aggression head-on, his own voice taking on a steelier quality as he pushed back against what he clearly saw as an unfair characterization of his positions. The billionaire had not built his fortune by backing down from fights, and he wasn't about to start now, even on national television. The host seemed almost surprised by Cuban's willingness to engage, as if he had expected the businessman to simply take the hits and move on to safer topics. But Cuban had spent too many years in boardrooms and on television panels to be intimidated by theatrical aggression, no matter how skillfully it was performed. He leaned forward in his chair, matching Colbert's intensity with his own brand of controlled passion. What followed was a rapid-fire exchange that had both men talking over each other, their voices rising as each tried to make his point while The other interrupted with challenges and counter-arguments. The audience sat in stunned silence, clearly unprepared for this level of conflict in what was supposed to be an entertainment program. Some audience members began shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether this was planned drama or genuine hostility. Colbert's questions became increasingly personal, moving beyond policy disagreements into what felt like character assassination. He questioned Cuban's motives, his integrity, and even his competence, all while maintaining that theatrical smile that had become his signature. But now that smile looked more like a sneer, and his carefully crafted persona was beginning to crack under the weight of his own aggression. Cuban's responses grew sharper and more direct, his famous temper beginning to show through his usually controlled public demeanor. He called out what he saw as the host's dishonesty, pointing out the loaded nature of the questions and the obvious bias in how they were being framed. The billionaire's voice carried the authority of someone who had faced down much tougher opponents than a late-night talk show host, and his willingness to fight back was clearly rattling Colbert. The tension in the studio was becoming unbearable, with crew members exchanging worried glances and producers huddling near the monitors, clearly unsure how to handle this rapidly deteriorating situation. What had started as a standard celebrity interview was turning into something much more dangerous, a public confrontation that threatened to spiral completely out of control. Both men seemed locked in a battle of wills, neither willing to back down or find common ground. As the segment approached what should have been a natural commercial break, neither Cuban nor Colbert showed any signs of cooling down. If anything, their conflict was intensifying, with each exchange becoming more heated than the last. The billionaire entrepreneur was clearly reaching his limit with what he saw as unprofessional treatment, while the host seemed determined to push even harder, as if he had some personal score to settle. The commercial break that should have provided a cooling-off period instead became the moment when everything truly exploded. As soon as the cameras stopped rolling, Cuban stood up from his chair, his face flushed with anger as he turned to face Colbert directly. The host, perhaps thinking he could maintain his theatrical persona even during the break, made the mistake of continuing his confrontational approach when the cameras weren't capturing his performance for the audience at home. Cuban's voice cut through the studio chatter like a blade, demanding to know what Colbert's real problem was and why he had turned what was supposed to be a professional interview into a personal attack. The billionaire's years of business negotiations had taught him to recognize when someone was operating in bad faith, and he wasn't about to let this slide without confronting it head-on. His words carried the weight of genuine outrage, the kind of anger that comes from feeling betrayed by someone you had trusted. Colbert, caught off guard by Cuban's directness during the break, seemed to realize for the first time that his carefully crafted attack had real consequences. But instead of backing down or attempting to defuse the situation, the host doubled down on his aggressive approach, apparently believing that his position as the show's host gave him the right to treat guests however he chose. His response was condescending and dismissive, treating Cuban's legitimate concerns as if they were simply the complaints of someone who couldn't handle tough questions. The studio audience, still seated and watching this unprecedented confrontation unfold during what should have been a routine commercial break, began to murmur among themselves. Many were pulling out their phones, recording what they were witnessing despite the strict no-filming policies that govern television tapings. The crew members stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let this play out, while producers frantically tried to figure out how to salvage what was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance. Cuban's response to Colbert's condescension was swift and devastating. Drawing on his decades of experience dealing with difficult personalities in high-stakes business situations, he systematically dismantled the host's behavior, pointing out the unprofessionalism and the obvious preparation that had gone into what was clearly a planned ambush. His words were measured but fierce, each point delivered with the precision of someone who had learned to use language as effectively as any weapon. The billionaire made it clear that he had come on the show in good faith, expecting the kind of respectful dialogue that had characterized their previous interactions. Instead, he had walked into what amounted to a televised trial, where he was expected to defend himself against accusations and characterizations that had no basis in fact. His disappointment was evident, but so was his determination not to let this kind of treatment go unchallenged. Colbert's facade was beginning to crumble under Cuban's withering critique. The host's carefully maintained persona, built on years of satirical performance, wasn't equipped to handle genuine confrontation from someone who refused to play along with the script. His attempts to maintain the upper hand through sarcasm and theatrical dismissal were falling flat against Cuban's straightforward anger and legitimate grievances. The situation escalated further when Colbert made the mistake of questioning Cuban's right to be upset, suggesting that anyone who appeared on television should be prepared for tough questions. This completely missed the point of Cuban's objections, which weren't about the questions being tough, but about them being unfair, loaded with false premises, and designed to humiliate rather than inform. The host's inability to understand this distinction only reinforced Cuban's growing conviction that this had been a setup from the beginning. Cuban's response was immediate and powerful, explaining in terms that everyone in the studio could understand the difference between challenging journalism and what amounted to a character assassination masquerading as an interview. He pointed out that tough questions were fine, even welcome, but they needed to be based on facts rather than twisted interpretations and deliberate mischaracterizations of his positions and actions. The billionaire's words seemed to resonate with some of the crew members who were nodding slightly as they listened to his explanation. It was becoming clear to everyone present that this wasn't simply a case of a guest being unable to handle criticism, but rather a legitimate complaint about professional misconduct disguised as entertainment. The power dynamic in the studio was shifting, with Cuban's moral authority beginning to outweigh Colbert's positional authority as the host. Sensing that he was losing control of the narrative, Colbert made his biggest mistake yet. Rather than acknowledging Cuban's points or attempting to find some middle ground, the host escalated his attacks, moving into territory that was clearly personal rather than professional. His comments crossed lines that even his most aggressive satirical performances had never approached, revealing an animosity that seemed to go far beyond anything that could be justified by their political or economic disagreements. Cuban's reaction was immediate and uncompromising. The billionaire had dealt with plenty of hostile business partners and aggressive competitors throughout his career, but he had never encountered this level of unprofessionalism in what was supposed to be a collegial media appearance. His response was measured but devastating, calling out Colbert's behavior for what it was while making it clear that he wouldn't tolerate this kind of treatment from anyone, regardless of their platform or position. The studio had become completely silent except for the two men's voices, with crew members, producers, and audience members all transfixed by this extraordinary confrontation. Many of the people present had worked in television for years, but none had ever witnessed anything quite like this, a complete breakdown of the normal host-guest relationship playing out in real time before their eyes. Colbert seemed to realize that he had pushed too far, but his pride prevented him from backing down or offering any kind of apology. Instead, he attempted to regain control by asserting his authority as the host, reminding Cuban that this was his show and that guests were expected to follow his lead. This approach backfired spectacularly, as it only reinforced Cuban's argument that the host had abused his position and violated the trust that guests place in him when they agree to appear. The billionaire's final response during the break was a masterclass in controlled anger, acknowledging Colbert's authority over his own show, while making it crystal clear that this authority didn't extend to treating guests with disrespect or dishonesty. Cuban's words carried the weight of someone who had built multiple successful businesses by understanding the importance of treating people fairly, even in adversarial situations. As the commercial break was ending and cameras were preparing to roll again, the tension in the studio had reached a breaking point. Both men were clearly angry, But Cuban's anger seemed righteous while Colbert's appeared petty and personal. The crew members were exchanging worried glances, clearly concerned about what would happen when they went back on air with this level of hostility still crackling between the host and his guest. When the cameras rolled again, the atmosphere in the studio was electric with tension that you could practically touch. Cuban settled back into his chair with the deliberate calm of someone who had made a decision during the break, while Colbert attempted to regain his composure and return to his performance persona. But something fundamental had changed during those few minutes off camera, and both men knew that the rest of this interview was going to be unlike anything that had ever aired on late-night television. Colbert tried to restart with a lighter tone, perhaps hoping to reset the dynamic and move past the confrontation that had just occurred. But Cuban wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. The billionaire had spent the commercial break processing what had happened, and he was determined to address it publicly, on camera, for the audience that had tuned in expecting honest conversation rather than theatrical ambush. The host's attempt at casual banter fell flat, as Cuban immediately called out what had just transpired, speaking directly to the viewing audience about the difference between what they had seen on camera and what had happened during the break. His words were measured but firm, explaining that while tough questions were part of any good interview, what had occurred here went far beyond professional journalism into something much more problematic. Colbert's face showed a flash of panic as he realized that Cuban was willing to break the fourth wall and expose the behind-the-scenes conflict to the television audience. The host's carefully constructed show persona depended on maintaining the illusion that what viewers saw was the complete picture, but Cuban was systematically dismantling that illusion with his straightforward honesty about what had really happened. The billionaire continued his exposition, explaining to the audience that he had come on the show expecting respectful dialogue, but had instead encountered what amounted to a predetermined attack designed to generate controversy rather than illuminate any real issues. His calm delivery made his words even more devastating, as viewers could see for themselves the contrast between his professional demeanor and Colbert's increasingly agitated responses. Colbert made several attempts to regain control of the narrative, trying to interrupt Cuban or redirect the conversation back to his prepared attack points. But the billionaire had clearly decided that transparency was the best approach, and he continued to speak directly to the camera and the viewing audience, treating them as intelligent people who deserved to know what kind of manipulation they were witnessing. The host's interruptions became more frequent and more desperate, as he seemed to realize that Cuban was winning the battle for the audience's sympathy simply by telling the truth about what had occurred. Colbert's theatrical techniques, so effective when used against prepared talking points or scripted responses, were completely ineffective against Cuban's straightforward honesty and genuine emotion. Cuban's next move was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than engaging with Colbert's attempts to restart the hostile questioning, he began answering the questions that should have been asked, the ones that would have provided real value to the viewing audience. He spoke about economic policy, business strategy, and current events with the kind of insight that had made him a sought-after guest in the first place, creating a stark contrast between substantive discussion and theatrical confrontation. This approach seemed to infuriate Colbert even more, as it highlighted just how far his interview had strayed from anything resembling journalism or entertainment value. The host's questions had been designed to create conflict, not to elicit information, and Cuban's willingness to provide that information anyway made Colbert's approach look even more cynical and manipulative. The audience in the studio was now clearly on Cuban's side, responding positively to his straightforward answers while remaining silent during Colbert's increasingly frantic attempts to regain control. The shift in energy was palpable, with the billionaire's calm authority contrasting sharply with the host's obvious agitation and desperation. Colbert made one final attempt to reassert his dominance, launching into what appeared to be a prepared monologue attacking Cuban's character and motivations. But this backfired spectacularly, as it only reinforced the billionaire's earlier points about the predetermined nature of the attack. The host's words came across as scripted and artificial, lacking the spontaneity that might have made them effective. Cuban's response was devastating in its simplicity. He stood up from his chair, looked directly into the camera, and addressed the viewing audience one final time. His words were calm but firm, explaining that he had tried to engage in good faith, but couldn't continue to participate in what had become a dishonest performance designed to mislead viewers about his positions and character. The billionaire's decision to walk away was clearly not something Colbert had anticipated or prepared for. The host seemed frozen, caught between his scripted persona and the reality of a guest who was willing to call out his behavior publicly. His attempts to stop Cuban or convince him to stay only made him look more desperate and unprofessional. As Cuban removed his microphone and prepared to leave, he made one final statement that would be replayed countless times in the days following the broadcast. He spoke directly to the camera, thanking the audience for their time and attention, while making it clear that he would always be willing to engage in honest dialogue, but would never again subject himself to this kind of theatrical manipulation, disguised as journalism. The studio fell completely silent as Cuban walked off the set, leaving Colbert alone at his desk with cameras still rolling and an audience that was clearly more sympathetic to the departing guest than to their host. The billionaire's exit was dignified and measured, a stark contrast to the chaos and confusion that his departure left behind. Colbert's attempts to salvage the situation and maintain his authority fell flat in the face of what had just occurred. His words sounded hollow and scripted, lacking the authenticity that Cuban had demonstrated throughout the confrontation. The host's carefully crafted persona had been exposed as exactly that, a performance that crumbled when faced with genuine emotion and honest communication. The cameras continued rolling for several more awkward minutes as Colbert tried to fill the time and transition to his next segment, but the damage had been done. The viewing audience had witnessed something unprecedented, a complete breakdown of the traditional host-guest dynamic that revealed the manipulative techniques often hidden behind the facade of entertainment television. This confrontation would become a defining moment for both men, but in very different ways. Cuban's willingness to stand up for himself and speak honestly to the audience would enhance his reputation as someone who couldn't be bullied or manipulated, while Colbert's behavior would raise serious questions about his professionalism and integrity as a host. The aftermath of this interview would spark countless discussions about the role of media personalities, the responsibility of hosts to their guests, and the difference between tough questioning and deliberate humiliation. But those conversations would have to wait, because right now, all anyone could talk about was what they had just witnessed, the moment when a billionaire entrepreneur refused to play along with a rigged game and walked away with his dignity intact. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below, letting us know what you think about Cuban's decision to walk away. Do you think he was right to call out Colbert's behavior, or should he have just played along with the host's aggressive approach?